He had 48 hours to fix the old water wheel before the county tore it down. Owen Costellan had $9, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a millwork restoration crew, and a habit of checking any old water wheel he passed for signs it might still turn. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off 8 months earlier, when the historic preservation contractor that employed him lost its state funding in a round of budget cuts, eliminating his entire restoration crew in a single afternoon. He had been moving through river towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The layoff notice had cited funding reallocation as its cause, language Owen had come to recognize across 8 months of towns exactly like this one as the specific bureaucratic dialect for deciding that preserving a region's historic infrastructure mattered less than whatever budget line item eventually replaced the funding instead. He had grown up around exactly this kind of restoration work, his own grandfather having repaired water wheels and mill machinery across 3 counties for nearly 4 decades, and he had learned, riding along on those jobs as a boy, the particular patience such restoration required, understanding a mechanism's original design intent before ever touching a single component. He found the old mill's water wheel on a cool morning in early autumn, standing beside a slow creek at the edge of Ashgrove Junction, its wooden paddles rotted through in several places, its axle frozen solid with rust. A faded county notice nailed to the adjacent mill building reading, "Structure condemned, scheduled for demolition, 48 hours from posting." Owen checked the date on the notice against his own watch, understanding immediately that whatever chance existed to save this particular wheel from a demolition crew's arrival had already been ticking down for the better part of a day before he'd ever walked up the creek bank to find it. An elderly man emerged from a small caretaker's cottage nearby, watching Owen study the notice with an expression somewhere between suspicion and desperate hope. "You're not from the county, are you?" he asked. "Come to gloat before they tear it down properly?" "I'm not from anywhere official," Owen said. "I used to do mill restoration work before I lost my position. I saw the notice. Is there any way to actually stop this?" "Name's Elias Renfrew," the man said. "I've kept this mill and its wheel running, one way or another, for 40 years, mostly for my own stubbornness rather than any real business need anymore. County's decided it's a safety hazard, condemned the whole structure, and given me 48 hours to clear out before they send equipment to knock it down entirely. I've got no money for a proper legal fight and no time left even if I did." "How much of that 48 hours is left?" Owen asked. 31 hours by my count," Elias said. "I don't see what difference it makes at this point. The wheel's been broken for years. I don't have the strength left in these hands to fix it myself, and I don't have anyone else who'd bother trying in the time we've got." "I might," Owen said. "I've fixed worse in less time, when the situation demanded it. I'd want to understand exactly why the county condemned it, though, before I decide whether fixing the wheel actually changes their decision." Elias explained over the following 20 minutes that the county's condemnation notice cited the wheel's disrepair as evidence the whole mill structure posed an ongoing safety risk, a justification that conveniently aligned with a private developer's recent interest in the creek front property for a small residential project. "I don't think the wheel being broken is really what this is about," Elias said. "I think somebody on the county council owes somebody else a favor, and my mill happens to be sitting on the land they need cleared to pay it." "That's a considerable accusation," Owen said. "Do you have anything to actually support it?" "Nothing beyond 30 years of watching how this county operates," Elias admitted. "I don't have proof, only pattern. That developer's approached me twice already about buying this land outright, both times well before this condemnation notice ever appeared." "I think that timing speaks for itself," whatever a formal investigation might eventually confirm or deny. If we can get the wheel running again before the deadline, does the county have any grounds left to demolish the structure as condemned? Owen asked. The notice specifically cites the wheel and its housing as the primary hazard, Elias said, producing the notice itself with hands that trembled slightly. If that specific hazard's resolved, I don't know that they'd have legal standing to proceed without reissuing an entirely new notice, which would at minimum buy considerable time even if it didn't stop the demolition outright. Owen spent the following hours working with a focus he hadn't summoned in months, understanding that 31 hours left no room for anything but the most essential, careful repairs. A wheel this deteriorated actually needed to run safely again. He began with the axle, working penetrating oil into the seized bearing housing and testing the shaft's movement by hand every 20 minutes rather than forcing it, understanding that a rushed repair here could cost him hours he didn't have if the mechanism seized again under load. He checked his own watch obsessively through those first hours, the particular anxious arithmetic of a man calculating exactly how much margin remained between the work still needed and the deadline bearing down on both of them. By the 6th hour, the axle finally turned freely, a low grinding groan echoing across the creek that Elias told him was the first sound that wheel had made in over 3 years. 25 hours left, Elias said, checking his own pocket watch with hands that had begun trembling from more than simple age. I don't know whether to feel encouraged or considerably more frightened, watching that clock keep moving regardless of how hard you're working against it. The paddle sections needed more extensive work. Several of them rotted through entirely, and Owen spent the following 8 hours replacing the worst of them with lumber he salvaged from a collapsed shed behind the cottage, working by lantern light once darkness fell. Understanding that stopping to rest now would cost him hours, he had no margin left to spend. His hands blistered badly by the 2nd hour of that stretch, and he wrapped them in cloth rather than slow down, understanding that whatever pain the work cost him mattered considerably less than the deadline it was racing against. Elias worked alongside him through most of that first night, holding lumber steady and passing tools despite his own limited strength, the two of them saying little beyond what the work itself required, both understanding exactly how much the remaining hours actually meant. It was during a brief rest near 4 in the morning, with roughly 19 hours remaining before the demolition crew's scheduled arrival, that Elias mentioned, almost in passing, a detail Owen immediately understood mattered considerably more than either of them had initially realized. My father kept a logbook on this mill for the 40 years he ran it before me, Elias said, rubbing his own exhausted eyes, recorded every repair, every inspection, going back to when the county itself certified this wheel as a registered historic structure, back in the 50s. I don't know why I'm thinking of it now, except that I suppose I'd like it saved too, whatever happens to the wheel itself. Where is it? Owen asked, already feeling the particular alertness that came whenever a stray comment suggested a piece of evidence neither of them had properly considered yet. In the cottage, in a drawer I haven't opened in years, Elias said. Owen retrieved the logbook himself, moving quickly despite his exhaustion, understanding that a documented historic registration might carry legal weight considerably beyond anything the wheel's physical repair alone could provide. He read through the relevant pages by lantern light, his own tired eyes struggling against the old, faded ink, until he found the specific entry he'd been hoping existed. The logbook confirmed exactly what Elias remembered. A formal historic structure registration filed with the state in 1958, a designation that, as far as either of them could determine from the documentation itself, had never been formally revoked, despite decades of the county apparently forgetting it existed. If this registration's still active, I don't think the county can simply demolish a state-registered historic structure on a mere condemnation notice, Owen said, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the rush of understanding what he might be holding. This might matter as much as the wheel itself running again. How do we confirm it's still active, with less than 19 hours left? Elias asked. We go to the courthouse the moment it opens, Owen said, and we don't leave until somebody checks the registry directly rather than simply taking our word for what this logbook says. They reached the county courthouse at 7 that morning, with roughly 12 hours remaining before the deadline, and found a records clerk willing to check the state historic registry directly, rather than simply accepting their claim at face value. The clerk, a careful woman who seemed genuinely engaged once she understood what was actually at stake, spent nearly 45 minutes cross-referencing the logbook's registration number against the state's own database, minutes that felt to Owen, watching the courthouse clock tick steadily toward the deadline, like some of the longest of the entire ordeal. The clerk confirmed within the hour that the 1958 registration remained fully active, never formally withdrawn, a fact that considerably complicated the county's own condemnation notice, since state law required a separate review process before any registered historic structure could be demolished, regardless of a local safety condemnation. I need this in writing, and I need it delivered to whoever's overseeing that demolition crew before noon, Owen said, understanding that a verbal confirmation alone would mean nothing to a crew already dispatched and rolling toward Ash Grove Junction. The county administrator, once presented with both the registry confirmation and photographic evidence of the wheel's now functional repair, agreed to suspend the demolition pending the legally required state historic review, a process that would take weeks rather than the remaining hours Owen and Elias had been racing against. The administrator's own relief at avoiding what would clearly have been an illegal demolition seemed, to Owen, considerably more genuine than any concern for the mill itself, though the practical outcome mattered far more than the administrator's actual motivation. I don't know how to thank you for what you did in that time, Elias told Owen once the suspension was confirmed, his voice thick with an exhaustion that had finally caught up with the adrenaline that had carried him through the night. 31 hours, and you gave this mill considerably more of a future than I'd allowed myself to hope for when that notice first went up. I think your own father's careful record-keeping did as much of the actual work as I did, Owen said. I simply happened to be standing here when the clock started running out. The state's historic review, completed within the following 2 months, formally reaffirmed the mill's protected status, permanently ending any further demolition threat and requiring the county to properly maintain rather than condemn the structure going forward. The review also noted in its formal findings that the original condemnation notice had failed to account for the property's registered status entirely, a procedural failure the county's own attorney later described, in a public meeting, as an oversight that would require internal review of how such notices were issued going forward. Owen stayed on at the mill through that winter and the ones that followed, formally hired by the county's own Historic Preservation Office to serve as the structure's caretaker, a position that gave him steady work, restoring the Fuller Mill building alongside Elias, who remained on the property as its historic keeper for as long as his health allowed. Owen spent that first year completing the wheel's remaining repairs properly, at an unhurried pace considerably different from the frantic 31 hours that had first brought the mechanism back to life, and restored several other neglected sections of the mill building that the original emergency repair hadn't had time to address. My father would have been glad to know his own careful logbook finally mattered this much, Elias told Owen one evening, watching the restored wheel turn steadily in the creek's current. He always said a record kept faithfully outlasts whatever reason anybody had for keeping it in the first place. Owen wrote to his own grandfather that winter, describing the mill and the 48-hour deadline and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine search for shelter to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the funding cuts ended his own restoration career. His grandfather's reply came a few weeks later, brief but proud in the particular way Owen remembered him always being, Told you a good millwright's patience would find use somewhere, whatever the state's budget decided about needing it anymore. Proud of you for working fast without working carelessly when the clock was running out on somebody who needed exactly that combination. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many structures, protections, and rights sit forgotten in a drawer somewhere, technically still valid but practically invisible, until somebody with almost no time left is forced to go looking for them? And what does it take? A stranger with exactly the right skill arriving at exactly the wrong moment. A father's decades-old logbook. A clerk willing to check a registry properly. For 48 hours to become enough time after all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage Line. For more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.